It was an ordinary Tuesday morning when the letter appeared, tucked tightly into the homeowner's mailbox, stamped with the official seal of the Homeowners Association. At first glance, it looked like any routine update or newsletter, but the bold red letters across the top told a different story. Notice of violation. Inside, the letter detailed that the mailbox, a simple and sturdy fixture that had stood at the edge of the driveway for years, was allegedly out of compliance with HOA regulations. The justification was vague, something about style uniformity and aesthetic guidelines. But the sting was in the fine. A demand for $500, payable within 30 days. The homeowner stared at the notice in disbelief. The mailbox wasn't new, but it wasn't broken or ugly either. It was functional, freshly painted, and far sturdier than many in the neighborhood. Still, the HOA claimed it didn't match the approved design for the community, a design that most neighbors had quietly ignored without consequence. The shock quickly turned into frustration. This wasn't the first time the HOA had overreached, but it was the first time it had come directly against the homeowner in such a personal way. $500 wasn't a small sum, especially for something so trivial. It felt less like a rule, and more like a power play. Word spread quickly around the neighborhood. A few sympathetic neighbors quietly admitted they had received similar warnings in the past. 4 things just as ridiculous: grass an inch too high, flower beds that weren't approved colors, even trash cans placed 2 minutes early at the curb. The HOA board, led by a handful of self-important members who relished authority, had built a reputation for targeting homeowners selectively, and 'tis him the mailbox had become their weapon of choice. The homeowner weighed the options: pay the fine and move on, or fight it. Paying felt like surrender, and surrender only meant opening the door for more fines down the line. Fighting meant risk, but also the chance to expose the HOA as hypocrisy. After all, if they wanted uniformity, why had they ignored so many other violations in plain sight? That night, as the lights dimmed in the neighborhood and the quiet hum of suburban life settled in, the homeowner made a decision. This wouldn't end with a simple payment. This would become a battle, a test of patience, strategy, and persistence. And though the HOA didn't know it yet, they had picked the wrong fight. The next day would mark the first step in a journey that would shake the neighborhood, divide opinions, and ultimately turn the tables on the very people who thought they held all the power. The fine had been a shock, but the sting of injustice lingered long after the notice was folded and placed on the kitchen counter. The homeowner knew that to fight the HOA, emotions weren't enough. The board thrived on intimidation, on the assumption that homeowners wouldn't question them, wouldn't read the endless pages of rules they themselves had written. That night, with determination outweighing frustration, the homeowner sat down with the thick HOA covenant book, a document so long and confusing that most neighbors admitted they had never read past the first few pages. The pages were dense, filled with legal language and vague descriptions, but slowly, patterns emerged. For every strict rule, there was often a loophole, an exception, or wording vague enough to leave room for interpretation. And when it came to mailboxes, the rules were surprisingly thin. The covenant only mentioned that mailboxes should be in good condition and not detract from the community's appearance. There was no mention of specific styles, colors, or designs. The fine for $500 suddenly looked suspicious. If there was no clear violation in the book, then on what authority had the HOA acted? To dig deeper, the homeowner decided to attend the next HOA meeting. These meetings were notorious for being dull affairs filled with financial updates and half-hearted discussions about landscaping. But this time, there would be a confrontation brewing. The day of the meeting arrived. In the cramped community clubhouse, board members sat at the front with clipboards and smug expressions. Homeowners trickled in, some out of genuine concern, others simply curious about neighborhood gossip. When the agenda reached violations, the homeowner raised the issue. Calmly but firmly, the homeowner asked the board to cite the exact rule that had been broken. The room grew quiet. The board shuffled papers. Glancing nervously at each other, they muttered about aesthetic standards and uniformity. But when pressed for the actual section of the covenant, they came up empty. Instead, one of the louder board members brushed off the question, insisting that the board had discretion to enforce what they deemed appropriate. It was a telling moment. The board's power wasn't rooted in clear rules, but in fear, confusion, and the assumption that no one would dare push back. The homeowner left the meeting with a small victory. They hadn't received clarity, but they had exposed the weakness in the HOA's stance. The fight, however, was far from over. A warning look from one board member, a woman notorious for nitpicking every violation in the neighborhood, hinted that they weren't going to back down quietly. She thrived on control, on bending rules to her will, and she had no intention of letting one homeowner challenge her authority. Baiketom, the homeowner began documenting everything: photos of the mailbox, copies of the covenant, even examples of neighbors whose mailboxes were in far worse condition but had never been fined. The plan was forming. The HOA wanted a battle of control, but what they would get instead was a battle of facts, proof, and persistence. What had begun as a single unfair fine was turning into something much larger. A chance to expose the hypocrisy of the HOA itself. The homeowner knew it wouldn't be easy, but with each step forward, the balance of power shifted just a little bit more. The board had underestimated the determination of someone who had been wronged. And soon, they would discover that the fine they thought was easy money would cost them far more than they ever expected. The days following the meeting carried a tension that hung in the air like a storm cloud. For a brief moment, the homeowner thought the board might reconsider, that perhaps their bluster would crumble once their authority was questioned. But, teache, Oa, especially under the influence of the most domineering board member, a woman who neighbors had quietly nicknamed the Enforcer, was not about to let someone chip away at its control. The retaliation began almost immediately. Within a week, the homeowner received not one, but 3 new notices in the mail. Each outlined supposed violations. Lawn edging not neat enough, garbage bins visible from the street, and a non-approved garden decoration. Every claim was trivial, exaggerated, or simply false. The homeowner's lawn was perfectly maintained, the bins were stored on schedule, and the small solar lantern in the garden had been there for years without a single complaint. It was clear what was happening. The board was trying to bury the homeowner in paperwork, to overwhelm with threats and fines until resistance seemed pointless. But instead of breaking under pressure, the harassment only fueled determination. Every notice was photographed, cataloged, and compared against the covenant's vague wording, and every time, the violations proved inconsistent with the HOA's own rules. Neighbors began to take notice. Some whispered their support, quietly admitting they had endured similar treatment. Others, fearful of the board's wrath, kept their distance, unwilling to be seen siding with the challenger. But a few brave neighbors offered their own stories, recounting how they had been fined for things as petty as leaving a garden hose on the lawn or using the wrong shade of holiday lights. The more the homeowner documented, the clearer the pattern became. The HOA wasn't enforcing rules, it was selectively targeting, and the board members seemed to relish punishing those who dared to resist their vision of control. But retaliation has a way of One evening, as the homeowner walked through the neighborhood, camera in hand, it became impossible to ignore the hypocrisy. Dozens of mailboxes stood leaning, cracked, or rusting, far worse than the homeowner's freshly painted one. Lawns stretched with weeds, bins sat openly by garages, and decorations cluttered yards in every direction. If the HOA wanted uniformity, they had failed spectacularly at enforcing it evenly. The homeowner's growing collection of photos painted a damning picture. Selective enforcement, petty targeting, and blatant double standards. But there was still the question of what to do with all of it. Keeping the evidence was one thing. Using it effectively would be another. The turning point came when another notice arrived, this one more aggressive than before. It demanded immediate payment of the original $500 fine plus late fees, threatening legal action if ignored. The board was escalating, desperate to intimidate the homeowner into submission. But instead of fear, the letter sparked resolve. The HOA wanted a fight, and now they were going to get one. Not through shouting or defiance alone, but through strategy. The homeowner realized that the true weapon wasn't anger, it was exposure. If the board thrived in the shadows of intimidation, then dragging their actions into the light would be the ultimate revenge. The plan began to take shape. It would require patience, precision, and the courage to stand firm when the board pushed harder. But, as the evidence piled higher, the homeowner knew one thing for certain. This was no longer just about a mailbox. This was about justice, about proving that no HOA, no matter how powerful it thought it was, could stand against the truth. The storm had been brewing quietly, but now it was only a matter of time before it broke open in full force. And when it did, the HOA would find itself caught in the very trap it had set for others. By now, the fight had grown beyond a single notice, or even the harassment that followed. What began with a fine over a mailbox had become a full-blown battle of principle. The HOA expected silence and obedience, but instead, they had awakened a homeowner who refused to bow to intimidation. And with each passing week, the plan to turn the tables solidified. The first step was research. The homeowner spent hours reading not just the covenant, but state-level HOA laws, regulations, and homeowner rights. Buried within those legal passages was a crucial discovery. HOAs were legally required to enforce rules uniformly. Selective enforcement, the very strategy the board relied on, was grounds for legal challenge. The homeowner's growing archive of photographs and notices had suddenly transformed into evidence of a potential case. The next step was outreach. Quietly, the homeowner began contacting neighbors who had whispered their frustrations in passing. One by one, stories spilled out. A young family fined for leaving a tricycle in their driveway overnight. An elderly couple harassed for planting flowers outside the approved color palette. Another homeowner penalized for a shed that had stood on their property long before the HOA even existed. Patterns emerged. And with them allies. The homeowner compiled testimonies, copies of violation notices, and photographs into a growing dossier. Some neighbors were reluctant to be named, fearful of retaliation, but others agreed to stand together. What the board once viewed as isolated incidents was slowly becoming a united front, armed with evidence and support. The homeowner filed a formal complaint with the state agency that oversaw homeowner associations. The complaint included documentation of selective enforcement, harassment, and failure to follow their own governing documents. It wasn't just a pushback, it was an attack at the foundation of the HOA's power. The homeowner also discovered another pressure point. Public exposure. A carefully worded post appeared online, outlining the story of the mailbox fine and the HOA's heavy-handed retaliation. Names weren't mentioned yet, but the post spread quickly through community forums and social media groups. Neighbors and even outsiders chimed in with their own HOA horror stories. And soon the board's behavior wasn't just a local issue, it was becoming a topic of wider ridicule. Meanwhile, the board grew restless. Letters became harsher, their tone increasingly desperate. They threatened legal action, hinted at liens, and warned of escalating consequences. But the homeowner, now armed with knowledge and support, no longer flinched. Each threat was catalogued, each violation notice filed neatly into the growing evidence pile. The true blow, however, came when the homeowner sent a formal demand letter back to the HOA. Within it, they cited the exact passages of state law requiring equal enforcement of rules, attached photographic evidence of widespread violations ignored by the board, and warned that further harassment would not only be contested, but also exposed in court. It wasn't just defiance, it was a declaration of war. For the first time, the board hesitated. They had wielded power for so long without challenge that the prospect of facing consequences unsettled them. The enforcer, still determined to push back, urged the board to stay firm. But whispers began among the other members, questioning whether this fight was worth the risk. The homeowner had struck the first true blow, and it landed with precision. What had once been a position of absolute control for the HOA was beginning to crumble under scrutiny. The mailbox, once just a quiet fixture at the edge of a driveway, had become a symbol of resistance, of standing up to petty authority, and of proving that even the smallest battles could ignite the largest wars. And the war was only just beginning. The board had been rattled by the formal complaint and the threat of legal exposure, but instead of backing down, they doubled their efforts. Pride, ego, and fear of losing control drove them to desperation. And when desperate people act, they often make mistakes. It began with intimidation tactics. Late at night, anonymous notes appeared on the homeowner's porch, warning to stop stirring trouble and just pay the fine. The handwriting was clumsy, the threats vague, but the intent was clear. Soon after, board members began patrolling the neighborhood more aggressively, clipboards in hand, stopping in front of driveways, peering into yards, and jotting down anything that could be construed as a violation. The homeowner was ready for it. Security cameras caught the suspicious visits, recording board members loitering near the property long after dark. Every shred of intimidation became another piece of evidence. Another thread in the growing case against the HOA, what they thought would instill fear only the argument that the board was acting outside its authority. Then came the smear campaign. The enforcer whispered to neighbors that the homeowner was difficult, reckless, and bad for the community. Flyers mysteriously appeared in mailboxes, claiming the homeowner was trying to dismantle the HOA altogether, endangering property values. But instead of rallying the community, the smear attempts had the opposite effect. Many neighbors, already weary of the HOA's control, saw through the tactic. Quiet conversations on sidewalks and at mailboxes revealed shifting loyalties. People who once kept their heads down began murmuring support, emboldened by the homeowner's stand. The tension boiled over at the next HOA meeting. The clubhouse was packed, not with board attendees as usual, but with homeowners eager to witness the confrontation. The board, seated stiffly at the front, tried to maintain control, but the energy in the room was different this time. Neighbors asked questions, sharp, pointed questions about where fines were going, why rules weren't enforced equally, and why certain people seemed to be targeted more than others. The homeowner.com and Methodical presented photos of crumbling mailboxes across the neighborhood, all untouched by the board. They recounted stories from neighbors who had been fined for petty reasons, while others skated by unnoticed. And when they cited the state law requiring equal enforcement, murmurs rippled through the crowd. For the first time, the board wasn't in control of the narrative. The enforcer tried to shout down the criticism, insisting that order and authority were necessary, but her words rang hollow. The harder she pushed, the more the neighbors pushed back. One by one, voices joined in, no longer afraid to speak. It was the moment the board had always feared. A community no longer under their thumb. By the end of the meeting, the board looked shaken. The vote of confidence they expected turned into a demand for accountability. Several neighbors requested audits of the HOA's finances. Others suggested new elections. The homeowner's evidence had not only weakened the fine against the MIT, had sparked something bigger. A movement. Back at home, the homeowner reflected on the journey. What had begun as a simple dispute over a mailbox had grown into a full-scale reckoning for the HOA. The board, once untouchable, now faced scrutiny from every angle. And though the battle wasn't over, the tide had shifted. The HOA had played every card it had. Fines, intimidation, smears. But the homeowner still stood, stronger than before, backed by truth, evidence. And now the voices of neighbors who had finally found their courage. The enforcer wasn't finished, yet her pride wouldn't let her retreat quietly. But the board's foundation was cracking, and all it would take was one final push to bring it down. The weeks following the explosive HOA meeting felt different. The neighborhood, once silent under the weight of the board's control, buzzed with conversations and quiet acts of defiance. Where once neighbors trimmed their lawns nervously and kept their bins hidden, now they questioned every notice, challenged every threat, and leaned on each other for support. The homeowner stand had cracked open the door, and now the entire community was pushing it wide. The board, however, wasn't ready to admit defeat. The enforcer, unwilling to let go of her authority, pushed harder than ever. More violation letters, more empty threats, more warnings of legal action. But her voice was losing power. Every letter was met with laughter, every threat with skepticism. Neighbors who once trembled at the sight of the HOA's seal now tossed notices aside or delivered copies directly to the homeowner, feeding the growing archive of evidence. Behind the scenes, the state agency had begun its investigation. The complaint, backed by documentation and testimonies, painted a clear picture of selective enforcement and abuse of power. Inspectors visited the neighborhood, quietly observing and reviewing records. The HOA, for all its bluster, could not hide from scrutiny. Then came the final blow. A letter arrived not from the HOA, this time, but from the state agency itself. It confirmed what the homeowner already knew. The $500 fine was invalid. The board had failed to cite any rule, had enforced selectively and had overstepped its authority. Not only was the fine cancelled, but the HOA was warned of penalties for continuing such practices. The mailbox, once the spark of the entire conflict, was officially deemed compliant. The homeowner could have stopped there, satisfied with victory. But justice had a way of demanding more. At the next HOA meeting, with neighbors packed shoulder to shoulder, the state's findings were read aloud. Gasps, murmurs, even laughter filled the room as the board sat stiffly, cornered by their own arrogance. One by one, neighbors called for resignations. Some demanded audits of HOA spending, while others pushed for new elections altogether. Dan Forcer, red-faced and trembling with anger, tried to defend herself. She claimed bias, conspiracy, even personal attacks. But the room no longer belonged to her. The neighbors, once silent under her rule, had found their voices. By the end of the night, a motion was passed to hold a special election. The enforcer and her closest allies were voted out within weeks, replaced by members who promised transparency and fairness. And the homeowner, they didn't just keep their mailbox. They became a quiet symbol of resistance in the neighborhood, a reminder that sometimes the smallest battles sparked the biggest changes. Neighbors who had once looked away now waved warmly, thanking them for standing up when no one else dared. The final laugh came one bright Saturday morning, months later, as families decorated their yards and children played in the streets. The homeowner placed a fresh coat of paint on the mailbox, not because the HOA demanded it, but because they wanted to, and as they stepped back, admiring the gleam of sunlight on the sturdy fixture, they couldn't help but smile. What began as a $500 fine had ended with the collapse of an unjust board, the empowerment of a community, and the sweet satisfaction of victory. The HOA had tried to break one homeowner with intimidation, but in the end, it was the HOA itself that had been broken. The mailbox stood proudly at the edge of the driveway, no longer just a container for letters, but a monument to resilience, persistence, and the power of refusing to back down. And with that, the homeowner truly had the last laugh.